Please welcome Andrea Young, Executive Director of the ACLU of Georgia.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today in observance of the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, Women's Suffrage. The title for this event is adapted by a speech given from Mary Church Terrell to the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1898, titled "The Progress of Colored Women." She closed with these remarks: "Lifting as they climb, seeking no favors because of their color, nor charity because of their needs, they knock at the door of justice and ask for an equal chance." As a Black woman, knowing that history, the efforts of my own mother and grandmother in the fight for equality, I cannot help but be emotional about the historic nomination of Senator Kamala Harris. The history being made today is because of the generations of women who have stood up for equality and justice. As organizers, community leaders, suffragists, mothers, and caregivers, we have been at the forefront of social change. We also know that too often, women of color suffragists like Nannie Helen Burroughs and Mabel Ping Hua Lee are on the forefront of line to bring about change, only to be sent to the back of the line when it is time to reap the benefits. While the 19th Amendment prevented the states from denying people the right to vote based on sex, it was still lawful to deny access to women to the ballot on account of race and color until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And even as we rightly celebrate John Lewis, few people know the name of Amelia Boynton, the Black woman who invited SCLC and SNCC to Selma, and who was also beaten and trampled on the bridge on Bloody Sunday 55 years ago. Today, we commemorate 100 years of suffrage by honoring all of the women who have fought and continue to fight for all of us. Many of you joined us back in June for the release of How Far to Go, The Status of Women in Georgia, 1970 and Today. The data compiled demonstrated that despite the progress women have fought for and gained in our state, we continue to see devastating disparities, especially for women of color. Today's event is a continuation of the conversation we are eager to have with women and organizations across the state about how we work together to advance a truly inclusive women's agenda. In 77 days, or less if you vote early like I do, we will all vote as if our rights depend on it, because they do. From the top of the ticket all the way down, the outcome of the election will have tremendous consequences for women across the country and the state. Whatever the outcome, we will continue to organize and fight. But right now, we are taking a moment of inspiration from the brilliance and persistence of women who fought for equality over 100 years ago. Now I have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Pearl K. Dow, Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at Emory University's Oxford College. Dr. Dow is a member of several committees for the American Political Science Association and previously served on the Executive Council of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. Her most recent research focuses on African American women's political ambition and public leadership. Raised in Georgia, Dr. Dow is a graduate of Savannah State University, holds a master's in political science from Georgia Southern University, and a PhD in political science from Howard University. Welcome, Professor Dow.
Good afternoon. I am Pearl Dow, the Asa Griggs Candler Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at Oxford College of Emory University. Today, I'm going to talk with you briefly about the women's suffrage movement and the work that continues. While we're celebrating the 19th Amendment, we have to acknowledge the rise of Senator Kamala Harris to become the Democratic Party's first woman of color vice presidential candidate. This is a momentous moment and a celebration for all. However, in order to really celebrate this moment, we have to acknowledge not only the suffrage movement, but the women that often have been ignored and their contributions have been dismissed in history. The suffrage movement grew from the abolitionist and temperance movement. Women were not allowed to participate with the men. And so these women formed independent organizations and sometimes auxiliary organizations to address these issues. When we think about the founding of the suffrage movement, we think about the Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls in New York in 1848. The majority of the participants who participated were affluent white abolitionists, and there were a handful of free Black men and women. In addition to Sojourner Truth, there were Black women such as Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and Harriet Tubman, who participated in women's rights efforts throughout the 19th century. There were early divisions in this movement that continued into the modern women's rights movement. This included elite and middle class women who did not work, and so they could not deal with the issues of poverty, illiteracy, or the menial employment that Black women were relegated to. Racism persisted in this socially progressive movement. The National Women's Suffrage Association, which became the dominant suffrage movement organization, held conventions that did not include Black women. They held marches that Black women were not allowed to participate in. When we look at the history of women's suffrage, which was written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, much of that document excludes the contributions that Black women provided to the movement. And as a result, today, we do not often think about the efforts that these women gave to the movement. In 1851, Sojourner Truth, with her powerful speech, Ain't I a Woman, challenged this, in which she argued that there was a unique position of Black women as a result of their race and gender. So when we think about the suffrage movement, particularly Black women and their participation, it is extremely unique. And when we look at a lot of the pictures of the movement, we see that white women that participated often were middle class. But with Black women, the issue actually expanded beyond class. And so I really enjoyed these two pictures here. On the right is a very popular picture of the leading middle class Black women in the movement. But we also see a picture of women that were members of the headquarters for colored women voters. And we can look at their dress and their hats and see that many of them most likely were domestic workers or that they were also possibly were farmers. And so this movement forms around Black women who organized, particularly in 1896, with the National Association of Colored Women. This becomes an umbrella group of the Black Women's Club movement. Suffragist Mary Church Terrell was the founding president. The group's motto was "Lifting as we climb," in which they advocated for women's rights as a way to uplift and improve the status of Black people. The suffragists wanted the vote not just only for women, but they also wanted Black men to be enfranchised. The suffrage was an important goal for Black women reformers. Unlike predominantly white organizations, the NACW advocated for a wide range of reforms to improve the life of African Americans. This was a result of the Jim Crow laws in the South that had enforced segregation. There were limited work opportunities for Black women. If you were an educated Black woman, you were relegated to probably being a teacher. If you had no education, that meant that you were either a farmer in sharecropping or that you were a domestic worker. Black women faced physical and sexual violence in the workplace. It did not matter whether they were working in homes or businesses as cleaning women or if they were in the fields. There were stereotypes that existed, such as Mammy and Jezebels. These stereotypes justified the violence that Black women face and their second-class status. Also, these women also wanted opportunity for education for themselves and for their children. This was extremely important considering the fact that segregated schools were second class and that the children and even the young adults who participated had very few opportunities to have access to quality books, and they also took instruction in dilapidated buildings. So when we look at this movement, despite all of the great efforts and the rewards of suffrage being passed, because of the result of the racism and even the class issues that pervaded the movement, there was work that was left to be addressed. At the beginning of enfranchisement overall, Black women still found themselves to be disenfranchised, and they felt that they had been abandoned by the Republican Party, which was the dominant party at the time, as well as by white women. There was a continued conflict between white middle-class women and lower-income white women. White middle-class women wanted to have mobility. They wanted to have parity with white men, while lower-income white women just wanted access to the workforce. These issues were very dominant, and they continued into the modern women's rights movement. And then also the stereotypes against women did not end with the passage of the 19th Amendment. There were stereotypes about women as leaders, and we see that that continues to persist today as women seek political office. So women as voters really have been extremely, extremely important to democracy. And this is one of the greatest legacies of the 19th Amendment. So when we look at women and how they vote, this is data that comes from the Center of American Women in Politics from Rutgers University. And what we see is that in recent elections, voter turnout rates for women have equal or exceeded voter turnout rates for men. And so we can see here that in looking at the lines that the blue lines are the women and the yellow line represents the men. Women constitute more than half the population and have cast almost 10 million more votes than men in recent elections. In every presidential election since 1980, the proportion of eligible female adults have exceeded the proportion of eligible men. In all presidential elections prior to 1980, the voter turnout rate for women was lower than the rate for men. But we see that the number of female voters exceeded the number of male voters in every presidential election since 1964. So this voting strength, as we now see, has transitioned to women seeking office and women being candidates. In the state of Georgia this year, we have seen an unprecedented number of women seeking office. There were 40 women who qualified for congressional primary races. And going into the general election, there are now 12 women running for the U.S. House of Representatives and 7 women running for Senate. So what are the next steps? How do we help these women not only just win, but be successful in the legislature? One of the things that we have to continue to do is that we have to continue to recruit and train women. We also have to train women to engage in campaigns as staffers. This is extremely important. It is important to have women as campaign managers, as fundraisers, as persons that contribute to marketing and ad buys. This really will strengthen the message and the campaign viability of women. It is also important to train women to transition to legislative bodies. This can be a steep learning curve, particularly for first-time candidates. One of the things that we have to help women learn when they enter these bodies is that rules matter, especially the unstated ones. Also, institutions are slow to move. We're in a period in which women are seeking dynamic change, but our institutions are not designed to move very fast. So how do we help these women navigate this? How do you address the issues that your constituents have elected you to do, but you're in a body that is resistant to change? How do we help women develop coalitions within the legislative body? We know that women are very effective at coordinating and coalitioning with other people, but what about in a deeply partisan climate? How do we address those issues? How do we help women navigate these type of legislative bodies? Also, we need to help women seek out effective staffers. Again, this goes back to training other women who can also participate not just only in the campaign, but also in these legislative bodies as aides and legislative directors. So, in conclusion, while the 19th Amendment is a momentous occasion to celebrate today and every day, we still have a great amount of work because not only do we want women to vote, we also want them to succeed as candidates and as politicians. And so, some of the resources and references that you may find interesting is one, the Center for American Women in Politics, which is a center out of Rutgers University. They have a phenomenal database of elected women, women who are running for office, and other resources if you want to know more about women in politics. Then there are several books as well. There's Ida, A Sword Among Lions, which is by Paula Giddens. There's a new book that has gained a lot of attention, Martha Jones' Vanguard, which is about Black women breaking barriers. And then there's the groundbreaking work, Rosalind, by Rosalind Tarbuck Penn, African American Women and the Struggle for the Vote. And there are numerous other resources for you as you continue to learn more about the suffrage movement and where we are today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Dow. We'll now turn to our panelists, four women who are actively involved in shaping Georgia politics. We'll hear first from Melita Easters, the Executive Director and Founding Chair for Georgia Win List, a 20-year-old organization committed to electing women to statewide office and to the Georgia General Assembly, who are committed to reproductive freedom and economic, educational, and legal equality for all women. Georgia Win List has raised more than $2.5 million to support the election of more than 70 endorsed women, 44 of whom currently serve. Georgia now leads the South for the percentage of women in its legislative bodies and leads the nation for the percentage of Black women legislators.
Thank you so much, Andrea. It's a great pleasure to join this panel, and I appreciate the ACLU hosting a panel on this historic day. While it's great to see the progress women as a whole have made in the last 100 years, it's sometimes shocking to see just how far we still must go to achieve equality across a wide range of measures. The strongest tribute we can now pay to the women who marched more than a century ago and then again during the civil rights movement is by voting for and electing more women to office at all levels. Women make up more than half the population in this country, and we must do more to achieve parity as elected officials, C-suite executives, and board members of large corporations. While women have served in Congress from Georgia since 1940, Georgia has never been represented by more than one woman in Congress at a single time, but we're on the cusp of great change. There's a strong possibility 3 Democratic women and 1 Republican woman will represent Georgia in our 14-member congressional delegation come January. Further, a Republican woman currently serves in the United States Senate by appointment, and she's also on the ballot. But Georgia lags far behind other states for women serving in statewide office. The only woman currently serving statewide is a Republican appointed to the Public Service Commission in 2018. There are 5 other women who have served statewide, but none ever as governor or lieutenant governor, although by Georgia we tried real hard in 2018. Georgia Win List founders began meeting 21 summers ago after a very well-qualified woman lost her bid for lieutenant governor. After complaining and commiserating, we decided it was high time to organize a formal way to give Georgia's Democratic pro-choice women candidates the same kind of support which had always existed for men as a result of the well-entrenched Good Old Boys Network. We followed the lead of Emily's List on the national level and endorsed our first candidates in 2000. We made history by endorsing the election of the first lesbian legislator in the Southeast, Carla Drenner. She serves to this day. As you mentioned, we recruit, train, and endorse Democratic pro-choice candidates. And while we train women for all kinds of races, we focus our endorsement efforts on legislative and statewide office because it is the state legislature which makes decisions about reproductive freedom. City and county races in Georgia are nonpartisan, and of course, judicial candidates are not allowed to discuss issues they might later rule on. So while we train those women, we don't endorse or write them checks. As you mentioned, we've helped elect more than 70 women, 44 of whom currently serve. In 2018, 9 of our endorsed women flipped seats, and as a result, legislative delegations for Fulton, Gwinnett, and Cobb counties flipped from Republican to Democratic control for the first time in decades. Georgia leads the South with our 30.5% of women legislators and the nation for our percentage of Black women legislators. But those numbers can improve. There are record-setting numbers of women on the ballot in Georgia this November. Republicans have 24 women running for House seats and 2 women running for Senate seats. Democrats have 78 women running for House seats and 29 women running for Senate seats. Georgia Win List has endorsed 54 stellar women for this election season. You can read all about them on the Georgia Win List website, which is www.gawinlist.org. We are so proud of the highly qualified women, some of them with science backgrounds, some of them attorneys, and more than half with graduate degrees who are running for office with our endorsement this year. Thanks so much for including me on this panel, Andrea.
Thank you, Melita. Your work has been invaluable to democracy in Georgia. Before we hear from our other panelists, we'd like to share a new action item each of you can take. We're launching #ThisWomanVotes, a video series capturing the personal stories of why women are voting this November. Please upload your 30-second video to inspire and empower others to vote. #ThisWomanVotes.
Hi, I'm Jordan. I'm an intern with the ACLU of Georgia. I'm collecting videos on why this woman votes. So do you have a story that you'd like to share? For me, it's my dad, who is a Navy vet who went back to school and received his master's degree. And my mom, who is a single mom of 5 who greatly benefited from government assistance and went back to school to get her master's degree. My grandparents couldn't vote when they were my age, but despite that, they did everything they could to provide for my parents. They did the same for me, and now it's my turn to do it for my nieces and nephews in the next generation by voting. There's so much at stake in this election. Black Lives Matter, climate change, healthcare, education, and we have the power to do something about it by voting. So please share your stories about why this woman votes. Your stories are so valuable in getting others inspired to do the same come this November.
Thank you. I'm now thrilled to introduce the rest of our panel. Mary Pat Hector is an Atlanta native, a graduate of Spelman College, and a current graduate student at Georgia State University. When she was 19, she became the youngest woman and person of color to run for public office in the state of Georgia. Mary Pat currently serves as the Georgia Black Youth Vote Coordinator, an organization mobilizing college students to be active in civic engagement. And she recently organized an amazing march, the Say Her Name March, to call for justice for Breonna Taylor and other Black women killed in police violence. Liliana Bakhtiari, an Atlanta native, is committed to advocating for human rights around the globe, advocating for women's health and children's health, refugee resettlement, environmental justice, and against human trafficking. As someone who is often the victim of discrimination due to her race, religion, and gender identity, She uses an interdisciplinary approach to promote social justice. She first ran for office in 2017 and is a graduate of Georgia State and Director of Social Justice Research for ECHO Market Research. Maria del Rosario Palacios is an immigrant workers' rights community advocate, public speaker, and small business owner. She was born in Mexico to two migrant farm workers who arrived in the United States after they were recruited to work in tomato fields in the mid-1980s. Maria has run for office twice since becoming a naturalized citizen. She made national media headlines in 2018 for challenging the Georgia Secretary of State's definition of Georgia citizen after being taken off the ballot for being newly naturalized. Thank you all so much for being a part of this discussion because while we are being inspired by the past, we want to use that inspiration to move forward in the future. And you all are so much the future of political and civic engagement and protecting our democracy. So my first question is, why did you want to be involved in the political process? And we'll start with Mary Pat.
Yes,
Please.
thank you so much for that question. Really, the reason why I wanted to get involved in politics was because I was already involved in community organizing and activism. I started at a very young age, and I began to realize that bringing awareness to issues and mobilizing around issues are important. But the real way to change is through policy. And so I knew that if I was going to be in the streets making noise, I also needed to be under the Gold Dome or involved in politics in any way that I can, both locally and at the major level within our political system. And that's really what made me want to get involved in politics.
Great. Thank you. Liliana?
Hey, yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Very similar to what Mary Pat said. I started marching in the streets with my dad when I was about 8. He was a survivor of the revolution in Iran and got me involved in politics at an early age. Um, and sometimes when you're a minority, you're just kind of born into politics because sometimes just existing is a form of protesting. So I got involved in that, and then I did crisis relief work. By the time I hit 18, I was doing crisis relief work all over the world and recognized that there wasn't much of a difference between what I was seeing abroad in underdeveloped countries and what I was seeing here at home in parts of Atlanta, and with people that are living below the poverty line. So I decided to come back home and build a stronger foundation here. And I realized the best way to do that was by helping shape legislation, which is what led me to run for office in 2017, which was right after the Muslim ban, which also affected my family. And I really felt like it was the only way to protect them was to be getting involved in shaping local policy and legislation, which is what led to me to run and which is what continues to lead me to wanting to remain involved.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning the Muslim ban. There have been so many challenges that have come about in the last 3.5 years that sometimes we have to go back and recount how many incredible challenges we've been confronted with. So thank you for lifting that up. That was my first couple of weeks as executive director of the ACLU of Georgia. So
What an uncomplicated time to start.
yes, yeah. Maria, what prompted you to run for office?
Yes, so definitely, I think I was always pretty geeky about watching C-SPAN as a young 12-year-old. But I would say really the first thing that got me into organizing on a more formal scale was an acknowledgement of at-large voting in Gainesville, where I was raised and still live. Knowing that at-large voting was disenfranchising the large community of color, we're a majority people of color city, knowing that that was something that was really holding us back really got me engaged back in 2012. From there, just the day-to-day life of being a single parent, knowing that childcare policies in our state don't let folks like me try to advance, try to finish college or work without having to pay sometimes more than what you can earn out of college, right? So seeing those cycles of debt and now seeing the impact of COVID-19 in Gainesville is what keeps me here, because I know there's policies tied to what infrastructure is there for healthcare, what availability there is for even taking sick leave. All of it's so closely tied. So these day-to-day things is what brought me into politics.
Right. Yeah, these are excellent points because so often people say, well, why does it matter? But one of the things we wanted to bring out in the women's report and that we want to really get lifted up in this discussion is that especially in our state legislature, people are making decisions that affect exactly those things. You know, what is the access to health care? What is the access to sick leave? What is the access to childcare? Um, and so, really helping people understand that your vote can affect those things that are so much a part of your everyday life. And that's why I think it's so important that women lift up voices because whenever they balance the budget, it's more work for some women, for women in our community. You know, they tend to cut the things that then fall to us to fill in the gap. So Mary Pat, I know you have really been an activist, organizing marches and working with the National Action Network. And what we see now in this era of Black Lives Matter, this sort of renewed activity since the tragic killings of George Floyd, of Ahmaud Arbery, of Breonna Taylor, of Rashard Brooks, of Sandra Bland. I mean, that we are reminded that we do have a new moment. And we've seen sometimes that I think we've seen some of the signs that say we are not our parents, or some of the things our parents negotiated. We want to renegotiate some of those agreements. So, what are some of those agreements? What is some of that status quo that's got to be renegotiated from the perspective of particularly, young women of color today who are active and who are challenging all of us we saw some incumbents defeated in the recent primary. What are some of the challenges and what are some of your aspirations for your own leadership or for what elected leaders need to do in Georgia if they're going to meet the challenge that's coming from your generation? Right, Pat?
Really, for women of color's voices to be heard. You know, one of the biggest issues or biggest concerns or complaints that we've heard from women in this movement now is that historically women of color have been silenced. When you think about the civil rights movement or you even think about Black Lives Matter, it seems to be very male centered. And Black women are saying, you're not going to forget about me. And Breonna Taylor is that person for us. And that's why we held the march here in the city of Atlanta to say Black women have been mobilizing and organizing for everybody, whether it be for Black men or white women. And you're not going to continue to erase us or our voices, and our issues deserve to be heard. And so when we talk about renegotiating things that our parents, our grandparents, not even our parents, our grandparents might have implemented, historically, that Black agenda was very male-centered and very male-focused. And so we are demanding that, if we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter, we want to ensure that all Black lives matter. The lives of Black women, Black trans women, that all of our voices are heard, and we can all receive equality in this country. And we need
Absolutely.
leadership. We need leadership like women. We need our leadership in our elected offices to look like this country,
Mhm.
and look like the people who vote. And we know Black women show up and show out for everyone, especially when it comes to voting.
Absolutely. Liliana, I know many of your issues are intersectional and your approach to them is multidisciplinary, which is quite amazing, the kind of work that you've done. But, talk about your aspirations for elected leadership in Georgia.
I mean, yeah, there's a lot of them. I mean, one of the things I really, really would love to see more disruptors, and us not demonizing those who are willing to stand up and do the work that it takes to disrupt. I think there's been, as we saw when we were battling HB 481, we had Black female legislators stand up in the house, in the state house, and speak out. And a lot of people are like, well, there were a lot of white Republicans who would have voted against the bill had you just not done that, or in literal terms, just behaved. So this idea of expecting women of color and those who are elected to play by white patriarchal rules and values, and that somehow that will go our way. I'm tired of that narrative. I think we all are tired of that narrative. It's why we see people resorting their frustrations to, while people are marching and taking back the streets, and you have leaders like Mary Pat who are standing up, and Maria, and like those of us who are getting tired of waiting our turn and are standing up to do things. So yes, we want to see more diversity in elected officials, but I also want to see elected officials not scared to stand by us when we're in the streets marching and asking of these things, because it's not well behaved. Because when we do things like it, I'm not going to be the person that's in the streets destroying property. But when we tell people, and we tell black protesters, and we tell people of color, and we tell nonconforming and trans folks that you broke a window at a bank, and how dare you do that? But yet the murderers of Breonna Taylor and of Rayshard Brooks and these other individuals are not facing the same sentencing. They're not facing repercussions that equal their actions. But we're going to come after you for that. What are we telling people their values are? So I want to be able to see, like diversity in leadership, absolutely. But I want to see those leaders not afraid to stand by us, and for those who claim to be allies to Black and Brown causes, to not silence the Black leadership and leadership of color that's already in place and expect them to quote unquote behave, because that in itself is just perpetuating oppression. And that just can't happen anymore. So I really need our leaders, our Democrats that are already in power, to stop being afraid, because lives are on the line more so than they ever have been. So that's what I would like to see.
Yes, as it was often said, well-behaved women seldom make history. And so much of what women do, there's so much we hear about policing of tone, and if you listen to all of these parameters that people want to put around, particularly women's engagement, you just tie yourself in knots. But I think those questions are yes.
You have one other thing. I think that also the biggest thing is to pay homage and understand that we are standing on we are all standing on the shoulders of the Black and Brown women that have come before us, and especially the Black and Brown trans women, because those are the originators of pretty any progressive movement we see today. That started in those communities, and we need to pay credit where credit is due.
Yeah.
So that as well.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Maria, what would you like to see, particularly, and I think this also goes for Liliana, I think we see often in our state politics a failure to understand that, Georgia's economy is so much a part of the global economy. And so when we see this, when we see issues around immigration, lacking that understanding that our state's economy is part of the global economy. It is not something that is separate. And your family's story is certainly a part of that narrative, that it seems like so many of our leaders fail to comprehend, that contribution, how essential the presence and the ability for people to move back and forth between the global, not just the global north, but also the global south, into our communities for us to be vital. But talk about your aspirations for our newly elected leaders in Georgia.
Thank you. So definitely, I think in Georgia we have so many things we can celebrate. We can celebrate definitely our contribution as a state. I think often it's said, being the number one state to do business. And when you look at agricultural and you look at the poultry industry and its current contribution right now to the national economy, the national food supply chain, I think there's things to celebrate. And I think as we celebrate those things, we can also celebrate the essential workers in poultry plants, like my parents, like my siblings, like I used to be when I worked in poultry plants. I know the day-to-day looks of that. I know the struggles. I know how difficult it is to pull out of poverty. So those are really the things that I would love to see our elected officials continue to take with them, their whole selves. They're so amazing. There's such an amazing amount of candidates who bring a diverse set of not just formal experience, but lived experience, because it would take decades of academic theory to truly understand why Black Lives Matter, right? To truly understand the immigrant struggle and the immigrant progress from different fields, from tomato fields to organizing fields, right? So those lived experiences are valid, and I ask that newly elected officials bring in them with them to the state legislature and to the congressional races that they're in and everywhere else, a diverse set of folks that will help them. I think often of amazing people like Representative Renita Shannon, Representative B. Wynn, Representative Brenda Lopez, who was the first Latina elected to office. The number of folks that she would bring into the state capitol is amazing. Not folks that had to have a whole wealth of formal experience, but they learned what they needed to learn and they shared their lived experience. I ask that newly elected officials continue to take that into consideration and continue to bring in with them as thought partners additional folks with these kinds of shared experiences.
Great, thank you. So let's close. I'd like to hear from each of you. What would be two things that you would want to see if your vision for women's suffrage was fulfilled? What would be sort of two accomplishments that would occur because of that? Mary Pat? Are you on mute? Yes, two things from that would we would find if your vision for women's votes were. You got it?
So yes,
Okay.
more
Yeah.
women
Yeah.
elected, and more women elected, but also more women of color, young women, right? Giving them an opportunity to lead, them working together, because we understand that women rule the world. So more women, but secondly, an emphasis on younger women, giving them an opportunity to lead, working hand in hand, because they make the world a better place.
Great. Liliana?
Yeah, to kind of piggyback on what Mary Pat just said, our women in leadership that have paved the way for us that are older, having a succession plan in place, really working with younger women to uplift them so that we're not turning against each other, so that we can actually see a united front in progressive causes, so that we're making sure to continue building that bench and having a plan in place, that we see a continuation of the building blocks that were put in place by the people before us. And yes, not just more women elected, but a diversity in the women elected. I want to see more Black and Brown women elected. I want to see non-conforming women elected, queer women elected, gender fluid, trans women elected. There being a greater diversity of that, and really encouraging the disruptors to feel like they have a place to talk and working with them rather than us operating in silos.
Great. Maria?
So I'll say two things. I don't want to repeat what the amazing panelists here have already said. I will say one. I think we need to put funds behind women of color so that one, they can get into office, and two, they can stay in office. It's extremely expensive to do both things, and we need to provide the livelihoods that women of color who aren't always in the decision-making table, provide the livelihoods that they deserve and that they need to be able to fulfill their roles. Secondly, it's also other immaterial things. We need policy changes around our childcare, our school system, different things that women show up in leadership, not just at work, not just in policy making, but then we go home and do it all over again. So we need to back up women in immaterial policies, that build those kinds of structures in and outside the home.
Yeah. Thank you. Melita.
I think the first thing I'd like to see is that this state needs to have a woman governor, a woman lieutenant governor. We need to return to a woman secretary of state. And I want us to see us elect these women who are currently Democratic candidates for Congress. But I think the fact that Nikema Williams was selected for the nomination when John Lewis's seat became available at his death, it shows us how important it is to have younger women on the bench, that we have a strong bench that future congressional vacancies can be filled from, that future statewide office candidates can come from. And I applaud everything that y'all have said about diversity. There's one area of diversity that is not often mentioned. Number one, we've got to keep some of the senior women there so that they have the seniority to be committee chairs, because we want women as committee chairs. But one other place of diversity I'd like to see is to have more women of color who are attorneys in the General Assembly. Right now, the women attorneys in the state Senate are all white women. There's not a black woman attorney in the state Senate, and there's only one practicing black woman attorney in the state House. And when Brenda Lopez ran for Congress, we lost a Latina woman as an attorney. Although now we have Zulma Lopez, who is a Latina woman who will be an attorney in the state House. But if we're going to talk about social justice reforms, criminal justice reforms, those black and brown women attorney voices need to be at the table with the power to offer amendments and be a part of the debate. So those are two areas, maybe three, I guess you'd say, that I would like to see.
Well, thank you all for this very rich discussion. Really important challenges, really important information. We are taking notes. We will share this, and we hope to really continue this work to build a movement where we are looking at and getting out of the silos and looking at the many umbrella issues that bring all women in Georgia together to promote our equality and our aspirations and our needs, frankly, and that we have a state that our politics actually, I was raised to believe that politics, is where they divide up the pie. And as they say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so we've got to make sure that women's issues are first and foremost in the highlight of our politics. And the way to do that is for women to run, for women to be engaged, for women to vote. We do vote, but we now have to start holding people accountable for policies that reflect our priorities and what we voted for. So with that, one of our priorities at the ACLU of Georgia is to ensure that voters understand the importance of voting down the ballot. That the top ticket races are highly consequential, but as you've heard, the Georgia legislature makes decisions that are critical to women's issues. And in Georgia, we have the opportunity to change the balance of power in our state house, and also particularly in Cobb County, in Athens-Clarke, we have the opportunity to elect progressive sheriffs and district attorneys. So we've just released a new comprehensive voting record of state lawmakers on reproductive rights issues. We've scored 8 bills dating back to 2012, all of which encompass a wide range of reproductive justice issues. These bills range from abortion restrictions and bans to conditions inside jails and prisons for pregnant women, to Medicaid expansion and other critical women's reproductive health issues. Each sitting legislator was scored on bills they voted on since being elected. And we hope you will use this when determining your votes and share it far and wide. It also makes a good Facebook when it's time to go lobby in the Capitol. Please use hashtag #ThisWomanVotes during all your Get Out the Vote activities to build momentum around our role as women in protecting our democracy. Let folks know when you request your ballot, when you take it to a drop box, when you go out to early vote. Volunteer to be a poll worker. You can go to the ACLU-GA website for the latest information on where candidates for the Georgia legislature stand on issues, for the location of drop boxes, for how to vote by mail. And encourage everyone in your network to plan their vote. Plan to vote as if it were homecoming, as if it were a Beyonce concert, or your best friend's birthday. Election Day is in 77 days. We must all vote like our rights depend on it, because they do. Thank you so much for being with us today for this very important discussion and observance of women's suffrage. As you have heard from our brilliant panelists, our vote is so critical, and the issues that we care about are the issues that are addressed and the needs that we have in our daily lives. The vote is so important to addressing those needs. So vote like your rights depend on it, because they do. Thank you.